We're taking you from a reactive phase to a proactive phase.
What is the risk for utilities that don't deploy GridWare?
From my standpoint, I see two things. One, operationally, and then secondarily, there's this.
What is a myth about fault restoration that is untrue?
For me, it's that you have to wait for the lights to go out before you know there's a problem.
And I'll add that you need expensive technology and backhaul to find a fault.
We're changing that delay from hours to minutes or even seconds.
There's clearly a need for this technology. How do we move from concept to scale?
I've heard numbers from some utilities, like 30 or more % of their outages or their events, they don't know the cause and they put them down as unknown.
Do you have any specific metrics that you use to measure success?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Piloting the Future, a podcast brought to you by Energy Central. Here on Piloting the Future, we're going deep with the leaders, innovators, and forward thinkers responsible for not just imagining where our power future is heading, but building it day by day. In each episode, we go beyond the headlines to hear from industry insiders and bold, game-changing innovators to separate the hype from reality. Lee, it's great to see you again for another episode of Piloting the Future. I am really excited about today's conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I talked to Tim Barat, the CEO of GridWare, 3 years ago. I interviewed him for The Climate Champions podcast, and he was a fantastic guest, and the company was only starting then. So I'm super excited to see where they are.
Yeah, and I'm excited because for those of you who don't know, I published a grid affordability and modernization report. And I think this is the first podcast we've recorded since dropping the report. And GridWare solves our number one trending challenge that I think about every utility in my report had. And that is how to build a weather and wildfire resilient grid in the new normal of extreme weather and climate change. And so after analyzing around 60 grid modernization reports from well over 60 utilities and 6,000 different challenges, this was the number one problem.
Yeah, back at Teneo Gas and Electric, I think it was 2010, we did a pilot of a similar, not anywhere near as cool or good or complete technology, but we piloted because we had the need then. And there are way more weather events happening now than there were then. The infrastructure has aged. So it's super important, this kind of technology.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the technology as well. I also work for a couple different solution providers in this space. So this is going to be a great conversation because it's come so far, so fast. So fasten your seatbelts. We're going to learn how to use a new type of sensing technology to build a more resilient grid with GridWare.
Yeah, and let me introduce our guests. I'm super excited to introduce Scott Lindsay, Director of Sales for GridWare, and Billy Terry, Chief Operating Officer at Consumers Power, which is a not-for-profit rural electric cooperative serving portions of Western Oregon, pretty close to me, here near Portland. My first question is for you, Scott. I'm really excited to learn how GridWare has progressed from when I talked to Tim 3 years ago. Can you tell us more about the company and how your solution works?
Absolutely. Thanks for having us on today. I'm excited about sharing today because we have come a long way. We've only been around for 5 years, and we were a startup, and we've transitioned out of that phase now. I think we're Bay Area company, technology focused on grid reliability and protecting workers in the communities they serve. And really, we take a different approach in that we look at the grid like a giant guitar. So the poles are frets, the strings are wires, and the grid scope is the pickup. And so historically, what we've seen is that everyone's trying to solve an electrical problem on the grid, whereas we're looking at it differently. Electrical is a component of it, but we're also looking at the physical aspects and the environmental aspects on and around the pole. And so this was something that drew me to it. It drew Billy to it. I mean, this is a compelling approach. And this is something that, as you mentioned, Tim Barat, he came at this with a different look, and here we are, and it's really amazing. So really think of it like a Fitbit for power poles. So really what you've got is something that's picking up the feeling, the sensing, the listening of what's going on and the physical aspects of the grid at all times. And so we're sampling 6,000 times a second on these devices. And so we're picking up a ton of data, and think about it beyond just the initial applications is also in aggregate what this could mean for the industry. So pretty exciting stuff. I would like to offer that also the one thing that's really kind of unique about this, and I always flag this for utility folks that I talk to, is the fact that we're taking you from a reactive phase to a proactive phase, not only from like a normal standard operating scenario, but also in scenarios where you're de-energized. So when you lose power, this is pretty critical because we're able to identify faults that are occurring even when the grid is down, because we're not grid connected. We've got solar power, battery backup, and it really works great for telling you what happened, when it happened, and where it happened. So really excited to be here, and thanks for allowing us the opportunity to share.
Yeah, I'm really excited by those analogies. One, I play the guitar, so I totally get what you're talking about, and I wear a Fitbit. So I'm a data junkie, and even more than me needing it, utilities need it. They need to know what's happening out on the grid, and this is a fantastic product to help do that. Can you talk about some of the challenges specifically you solve for utilities?
Yeah, well, really, there's two big ones, and this is something that's been an issue for a long time, but we call it the visibility gap. So it's this scenario wherein you have an event that occurs on the distribution system, and you don't have visibility on it until after you get someone on site, or there's an outage and someone calls it in. So really, it's this space between, and it's a big space. So it's a space between where the substation starts and the customer ends, and this is where all of the risk lies. And so this is something that we've put a lot of time and effort into categorizing in terms of naming the problem. And the problem is hazard awareness delay. And so from that standpoint, again, it's this time between when the hazard occurs and when the utility becomes aware of it. And what we're doing is we're changing that delay from hours to minutes or even seconds in terms of allowing for utilities to have full visibility on their distribution system, even during outages.
I know in San Diego, there are a lot of canyons. And so troubled people would drive the line looking for the issue, not knowing exactly where it was. And then they would come to a canyon. They have to go all the way back to the freeway, get off on another exit, and come back and pick it up. So knowing where the issue is hugely important.
For sure, yeah. And even if you think about urban applications where you're trying to go door to door during a storm, or maybe you're in some areas that are really hard to access because you've got folks with big backyards and you've got a line down situation, which we've seen a couple of, you need to get there quickly and let them know. And so in this instance, instead of banging on 20 doors, you'd go to one door and you're able to tell with pretty good accuracy where you need to be.
That's awesome. Hey, Billy, can you tell us about your deployment and the experiences that you had with GridWare?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me, Lee and Kim. I appreciate it. As Scott kind of mentioned, we really started with GridWare because we were looking for visibility in our circuit. These were circuits where we really had SCADA at the feeder level, but beyond that, our own OMS system was really dependent on just outage phone calls, right? Power's out. Okay, so then we're making predictions on where we think it's open. Well, with GridWare, we are actually able to determine exactly what device is open downstream without any SCADA visibility, and really within a couple spans of where the fault occurred. So that's really been it's been really important for us on our troubleshooting. And that hazard awareness delay that Scott mentioned, I mean, that lag has gone from hours to minutes. We get the reports. We know where the fault occurred and where to send our crews. And a lot of times, it's been so much more precise on our outage restoration and how we use our resources. And, we've prevented, wildfire ignition, prolonged outages. It's really changed the way that we think operationally and how we respond to outages in the areas that we have the GridWare sensors.
When you started deploying the technology, were there any surprises or things you learned that you didn't expect?
I mean, there were some things that we hoped for that we witnessed. The technology was by far the easiest technology that we've deployed. It's literally, you put 4 lag bolts in and you turn them on and they're up and running. There's no power to them. We're not applying sensors to the conductors. They're up and then they're on. And then when a fault occurs, we know exactly where the circuit opened up at and where the fault is at. So we feel like it's really important benefit for us. Grid scopes work when the power is off, as Scott said. That was a huge problem we were trying to solve. In today's world with public safety power shutoffs, wildfire mitigation, And during even long winter duration storms, it could be hours or days before we're able to get out to these remote circuits. And during that time, we have no idea what actually is happening to our circuit. We know it opened up. We don't know how many locations. We don't know how we have to divert our resources, what materials. With grid scopes, we're able to quantify that and know what's happening on our line, why it's de-energized. And that's a really important piece of solving that problem.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's a long way from having to drive the line looking for which light is out to pinpoint where something is. For either one of you, Scott or Billy, what is the risk for utilities that don't deploy GridWare?
So two things. One, from my standpoint, I see two things. One, operationally, there's a component to it where Billy and I just touched on it, is basically you're kind of flying in the blind. And part of some of the old school mentality was run to failure on the system, and then you replace after you find a failure. That's not what we're going for here. This is a scenario where you're getting real-time visibility on the distribution assets. They're critical, they're important, and we're monitoring them to allow for utilities to know how to mitigate and to fix things quickly, and to even preempt potential scenarios that could end in ignition or injury. So that's really important. And then secondarily, there's this societal component, which is this community standpoint. If you think about it, the delayed response can lead to risk for people, property, environment. These are all things that we're trying to solve here. And if you think about it from the standpoint of, like, one example, and as we've seen this multiple times, you get a line down situation in someone's backyard, and it's a live line down. You've got conductor down in someone's backyard, and if there's no visibility on that, that is a huge hazard. And so from this instance, we're able to report that in near real time and help reduce that risk.
Not only to people directly because it's a live wire, but I know that there are some places where that live wire might be in a bush that's dry and where that's going to create a fire that's going to spread. So multiple reasons why that's important. Billy, given that you've been through this, what are other benefits that you want to tell other utility executives about that would excite them about this technology?
Well, Lee, I think there's a lot of benefits, and we hit some on those. And Scott, as Scott mentioned, it allows us to become, transition from being reactive to proactive, and how we both monitor our system and operate our system. We're allowed to be we have some insight, so we can be more proactive. But they're giving us real-time data, what's happening at that pole, and I think that's pretty unique. That's extremely unique in our business. We don't get that granular, so we're getting that at the pole level. So that's really reducing our truck rolls. It's really prioritizing how we spend our money. We've allowed for a greater level of safety. You had mentioned earlier in San Diego about freeways. Now, we don't have freeways where we have them, but we do have very steep, extreme canyon crossings and lots of logging roads to drive down. And you get to a section, and now you got to turn around and you got to drive an hour out and around to get to that section. We've eliminated all of that time. So it's been extremely beneficial, and as we work our outages and how we respond to them.
And do you have any specific metrics that you use to measure success?
Yeah, we do. Of course, as all utilities, we look at different things, but response time, crew efficiency, outage minutes, all of those things are important. And we've seen, tremendous reduction in time in the areas where we've had the grid scopes up. But we also look at other things, that sometimes traditional systems miss. How quickly we are aware of the fault, that's really critical for us, especially during fire danger. And it allows us to make some decisions within our dispatch if we have to open up circuits or if we have to do things because of an outage. And the hazard awareness delay, we've talked about that a little bit. That's gone from, we have a circuit out, we have no idea, to hours, to days, potentially, to minutes of, well, here's the report and here's where it's at. And now we're able to deploy almost immediately.
Seems like a must-have for any utility. Scott, what are other metrics that you see utilities benefiting from improving using GridWare?
Yeah, well, I'll double down on what Billy said related to the dispatch efficiency, because that's really critical for utilities. And there's the alphabet soup of acronyms associated with, measuring indices related to reliability. And those are all key indicators for utilities, and they're tracked by the regulators and all of those fun things. But beyond that, I would say that event detection in terms of the improvements are critical, because now we're going from unknown outages to known outages. And a lot of utilities have to track their unknowns. And in this instance, we're providing visibility that they didn't have. I've heard numbers from some utilities, like 30 or more % of their outages or their events, they don't know the cause and they put them down as unknown. And then we're helping to provide visibility related to that. So I think that that's probably one of those key things that is pretty helpful for folks as they look at the technology.
So moving on to the visionaries' take, this is where I like to say we're going to cut through the BS and get right to the point of how do we get out of pilot hell and into production paradise. So, Scott, there's clearly a need for this technology. How do we turn these successes that you're sharing with us? How do we move from concept to scale?
Yeah, good question. So really, we're in a scenario where we got to change the mindset. We got to change the hearts and minds of traditional utility folks. And there are folks out there like Billy and CPI who are early adopters, and there are exceptions to the rule. But typically, you'll find that utilities are trailing technology adopters. They're a little bit more conservative when it comes to spending money on technology. And one of the things that I'm personally most excited about is leveraging technology for purposes of, and I know you guys are too, based off of your podcast, to make things better on the grid. And so from that standpoint, we've gone from this kind of pilot phase and we're more developed now. We're in a scenario where we've got over 150 million hours of monitoring with utilities, consumer-owned utilities like Billy's, and investor-owned utilities throughout US and Canada. And we've got over 24,000 units deployed in the field, with many more coming. And it's really great because we're creating this, and the goal is to create more awareness, comfort, and adoption just by seeing anecdotally how this is working for utilities nationally. And like CPI, I mean, I've had a long-standing relationship with Billy. Used to be at an engineering firm that did work with CPI. And when I came over, I was excited to share with them because they're thought leaders. They are folks that everyone looks to in the state. CPI was the first, and Billy brought this from his days at PG&E. He was the first to do a wildfire mitigation plan in the state. And now most all of it, and everyone has to have one in the state. And on top of that, everyone looks to CPI as like, hey, where do we go from here? And Billy and his team, they even host events that bring in technologies to talk about this at the utility. Sorry, Billy, I'm on a CPI rant right now, but this is why we're excited about these partnerships, is because folks tend to follow other folks, because it's one of those scenarios. It's the know you, like you, trust you community. And once you get to a point where you feel like someone's having good experience with something, then others are going to try it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly why we're doing this podcast, because it's hard to disseminate this information so that those of us in the know in the industry can just move beyond the pilot, like we can skip the piloting stage, which is, I wanted to ask you, I think you had a full system deployment that actually skipped the pilot. Can you tell us more about that and why? Why were you able to get them to skip the pilot deployment? I know that's important for some utilities, like they want to understand how their service territory and how technology responds, but you guys had a recent one where you skipped it. Why?
Yeah, that's thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, so Truckee Donner PUD recently had a vote by their board to approve a full system deployment in the Lake Tahoe area, and it's 2,600 units over their full system over a 5-year period. And part of it was that they had seen the results in neighboring utilities. And so don't think of this as just because your utility is protected, that doesn't mean that a fire isn't going to just jump the line and jump into your territory. And as good as CPI is at mitigating their system, they're still going to get stuff that'll come in from neighboring utilities, in particular with their service territory, because it's so funky. But if you look at it from the standpoint of, like, this is an investment in the future for these folks. And part of the calculus that it was involved there is that they did a cost benefit analysis associated with undergrounding, and it was substantial. So we are like less than 1% of the cost of undergrounding their entire system.
I love to hear that.
And it's like, why not have full system visibility at a really low cost compared to undergrounding your entire system? So that was a big one.
Faster.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and even if you are going to underground, you can put these on there temporarily and then move them somewhere else. I mean, it gives you a lot of operational excellence in terms of being able to do some cool things. So yeah, pretty exciting.
What about some of the barriers? Like, what are utilities up against as far as like what's standing in the way, maybe technically or or barrier for being able to adopt?
I talked about the trailing technology adopters, and I work exclusively with consumer-owned utilities, and so they've got different financial incentives in terms of how they buy. But there are, again, the early utilities like CPI that jump on board with this stuff. But procurement's a big one. So it's really like building the internal inertia within the utility to be able to get it over the finish line, to get all the right people to get behind it, and to really pay attention to those things that are indices that indicate that you've got concerns like wildfire, weather, reliability, all that kind of good stuff. Another one, and Billy can speak to this too, is data integration. So we don't want to be another one of those dashboards. So this is a tough one because it's like everyone's got their own platform that they're using and they want it to all integrate. And we're working really hard and we're making significant strides to do that. But that's a big barrier because everyone looks at it and says, hey, we've got all these systems here, and it makes it hard to not think about how that's going to impact your existing operations. And then the last I'll say is communication. So in rural areas like CPI, cellular communication is our primary. But if you step out into some of the more rural areas, we do have some other options related to that. But it's a lot easier just to have it all within one platform for communication purposes.
So I think communications is so important. Sometimes the communications can be the afterthought, but if you don't have good communications, then you can't reap the benefits of the technology. And like you guys are bringing up in rural areas. And so many, for so many use cases, we need it in the rural areas, but then the rural areas lack the communication. So like, can you do a double click on maybe like how it works, or what are you seeing with the satellite piece? Maybe talk about it from the rural perspective. Like, how can we get that advantage? Because that's where also a lot of the safety and the OpEx savings come in.
For sure. Yeah, one thing that I liken this to is like the early days of third world countries when they didn't have telephones, and now all of a sudden everyone's got mobile phones. And so this for me is a leapfrog in technology. Yeah, and in particular, and I'm passionate about consumer and utilities in these rural communities because they're doing great things for America, and we want to make sure that we're providing them with all the incentives that the big boys get when in the the urban areas. And so from that standpoint, it really is important that this is something that we resolve. And so we've got basically a three-pronged approach that we're taking to this. We've got the cellular as the base. We also have the ability to communicate between devices, and we're actively working to expand that to a mesh network that'll allow for, yep. We currently do a peer-to-peer. So we are able to communicate between multiple devices. So if one device loses signal, it will carry backhaul for the other one. And then something else that's really important to note is that we're only pushing really small data packets. So it's very small amount of information that's going through these devices. So don't require a ton of backhaul, but we're monitoring 6,000 times a second. And when something anomalous occurs, then we spin up and we start communicating. Well, we got to have that communication. So that's important. And then we also have Starlink as backhaul. We're very desirous of seeing the FCC approve the chipset to allow for, and I know that T-Mobile's gone down that path, to allow for the small monolithic device to be able to have a chipset in it that does satellite. And so then we'd have 3 layers of redundancy related to the communications, which would be really important.
So you got all the communication redundancy built in, not just carrier to carrier. I know a lot of utilities are looking at multi-carrier, omni-carrier type solutions, but what you've got is multiple communication types. And because the data packets are so small, you can take advantage of satellites. But also, you don't have to worry about the cost of large data going over a 5G network, which can be cost prohibitive for a lot of these new technologies, especially, at the edge. It's just too much data to be able to get the benefit out of it.
Yep. Yeah. And one other element to that I'll add is that because we've got one grid scope that's communicating with the entire fleet, because we've got the edge and then we've got, the cloud, we have the learnings of a single device that's shared with the entire fleet. So if we see an anomalous event that's very strange, like a pole failing at the base or something along those lines, those are the types of things that the entire fleet now knows because we're able to communicate in aggregate with the entire system.
Very, very cool. So Billy, I'm going to ask you my last question, but I think Lee, you should chime in on this, given all your experience as well. I was just wondering, is there anything else you think that needs to change across the industry to remove any turbulence for this innovation to get adopted? What are you seeing from your utility perspective Billy, and maybe Lee, you might want to add your 2 cents.
First off, on the communication piece, I think it's really important, as Scott had mentioned, especially with consumer-owned utilities. Our motto is do more with less. So with the multiple options for backhaul, we have made significant investments in these rural areas, and the ability to maximize that and use another device on maybe a fiber network that we built out to SCADA or an AMI piece, and be able to integrate that backhaul and use our current investments is really huge. We're excited about that, leveraging that opportunities as we move forward through that. But really, I think when we talk about adoption of innovation, I think a really important story is when we started with GridWare, we installed our first set on a very remote 3-phase section of line. And Scott said we had a weird system. I would disagree with that, but we have a cooperative rural 3-phase system. So with that means when we have a fault, if it is only going to in those rural areas and it contacts a single phase, we do not have 3-phase tripping. So thus, right, less members impacted, but we have energized conductor potentially, 1 phase out, 2 on. And one of the problems that we solved working with GridWare is we added a magnometer to these grid scopes, and with that, now we're able to see not just power off, we're able to see which phase is out, and that helps our crews tremendously. It also helps with outage detection, where we're going, and the awareness that, hey, yeah, we have an outage, and we're getting phone calls, but it's just a phase, and that helps us tremendously with that. So that's really just a great example of how we used the technology, innovated it, and then deployed it out throughout our system as we continue to expand.
Just a quick question for me on that one. Forgive me if this was obvious, but it's the grid scope is in the pole.
Correct.
And you don't have to put anything on the 3 phases. It's just one deployment on the pole, and as you said earlier, 4 bolts.
Yes, one little device that Scott held up, and now with the new technology that we've deployed, we're able to see actually all 3 phases, just not a power on, power off situation, which I think that was fairly unique, right, Scott, to GridWare when we did that?
Yeah, well, we had some unique instances related to your system, Billy, and so it was helpful to have that visibility. Thankfully, it was in pipeline for upgrade on the system, and it was something that we could put to work, so it was great.
Yeah, it worked out great.
We had huge issues with phase identification. It's in San Diego. Another thing that makes it difficult for utilities to move in this direction with this type of technology is there's an old business saying, I'm not sure it's out there as much as it used to be. There used to be that if you go with IBM, you keep your job. And so it was hard to take a risk. And a lot of utilities, by just going along and doing things the way they were done, that keeps your job, and taking risk isn't really beneficial. But now with the cost pressures, many utilities are seeing, it doesn't really hold like it used to hold. I mean, there needs to be more risk taking. I think a lot of utilities are moving in that direction where they want solutions that will really help improve the utility. And this one obviously does. In 5 years, what's going to be the biggest challenge for the energy industry? And anybody and everybody should give it a go.
So really, for us, it's managing the intersection of electrification and resilience. And obviously, there's a lot more demand. There's a lot more pressures on the industry. There's increased costs. There's aging infrastructure. And then we've got the environmental components that are all kind of coming into this perfect storm of problems for the industry. And so we don't want to compromise safety or reliability, but these are all pressures that are being placed on the utility. And I think from that standpoint, that's the biggest challenge for the energy industry.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Scott. And I'd also add really transmission and generation constraints in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, we're projecting tremendous load growth, and we really need some new firm generation resources to be able to sustain the projections in the future.
So how do those energy challenges impact the utilities? How does that translate to utility challenges?
A lot of utilities are working with very scarce resources, not only financial, but also with people. And so if you ask them to do more, as Billy said, it's hard because, you got to do least cost type scenarios for a lot of these utilities. But under those scenarios, it's just like one more thing that the utility has to do without increasing rates. And it's hard to find the way to do that. And so these are things that are ever present for utilities and boardrooms and conversations related to operations at utilities.
That was going to be my point, was this pressure on affordability. But when you look to technologies like this that give you leapfrog, and is so affordable when you compare it to business as usual, so the technology that we've been using for the last 20 years, like comparing that, now what we can do and reduce operation expenses with this new technology, do it more affordably, is really exciting, and drive some of these leapfrog impacts, especially for the rural communities. This is great to hear.
Yeah, it's really hard to put an ROI on risk, and we are in a very ever increasing risk environment as a utility right now.
Okay, final hot seat question. What is a myth about fault restoration that is untrue?
For me, it's that you have to wait for the lights to go out before you know there's a problem.
And I'll add that you need expensive technology and backhaul to find a fault.
All right, that's great.
Well, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. Tag us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Share this great story and this great success, as well as subscribe to the Energy Central podcast feed, where you can hear more conversations like this happening. And since we mentioned it, I'd love to plug it. If you haven't had a chance to read our grid affordability and modernization report, I call it's a special report on affordability. It really covered so many of the conversations we talked about today. Go to innovationforce.io. Please download that report. It's available for you for free. It's also on the Energy Central community. So you can download the report right from your Energy Central portal. So with that, Lee, I think we can fasten our seatbelts and bring this one in for a landing. I was very excited to hear about the state of this new technology, and not only how it can benefit us from a fault detection point of view, but safety, reliability, and help people in the communities that need it the most.
Yeah, there are a lot of great technologies out there that really are new, and now they're proven at utilities. And with these cost pressures, this GridWare solutions, and there are many others that we have on other episodes, can really make an impact.
So go check it out, gridware.io.
Yeah, innovate, innovate, innovate.